Shalom Aleichem. Hayom Rishon, today is Sunday, and it's Beis Adar, the second day in the month of Adar. And we're learning the Mamer Zachor as a Amalaik from Tafshan Lamed Gimel, which this year is 52 years ago. Ban, Ban Shana. Ban could mean many things, including Bina and Ben, and it could also mean Malchus, which is Bas, so it's all there. Ban Loshen Bina is Moichin, Ban Loshen Ben is and Ban going on Malchus is Malchus, Bas. The shares is Chutzpa for the four Shleima for Mer Chaim and Chayetzira, Liba Bereiner Bas Alta Miriam, Shlemi Yosef Ben Risha, Chaim Mushka Bas Natal, Avigal Bas Bela. It's Chutz for Lilo Nishmas HaKodsh, Tzvi Ben Alexander HaKoyin Hashem, Yemkim Dame, Tzvi, and Mesha Yehuda Ben Tzvi Yosef. Now Rabbi said this is the Mamer Tafshan Lamed Gimel. And on Friday we learned Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach the Mamer of Shkolim, Kitesas Reish B'nei Yisrael. And there was a nice chap, nice unusual aspect to that Mamer. That the Shaila was, how could you count Yidden? Yidden are above a Mispar, and the answer is Zeh Yitnu, you count only the Gilui, and then the Helam becomes counted as a result, which is the second half of the shekel. And the Rebbe connected it to Vayakal Moshe, that Jews don't need to be gathered, they're naturally one, but only because of Chet Egel and so on, there's a need for Vayakel. And after there's the Vayakel from the bottom up, there's the Vayakel from the top down, that the Achdus has brought into the world. And the inference is, although it's not stated explicitly, that the same is also true by Shkolim. Now we're learning Zachor, the Mamer of Pasha Zachor, which is 2 weeks later, right? Yud Gimel Adar Sheni is 2 weeks after Shabbos Mevarchem Adar. I don't know the exact dates, but it's 2 weeks later. In other words, that year there was a hefsek between Pasha Rishon and Pasha Shniel, like it says in Chazal. And it's right before Purim. Purim would be Sunday the next day. And to say it in the signain of Maskilim, it's the same Mamer. The Mamer that the Rebbe said Shabbos Zachor, and the Mamer that the Rebbe said the next day Purim, which I listened to the tape several times, Baruch Hashem, already. Ish Yehudi Chaya V'Shushan Abira, which my Mordechai Ben Yarbe Shem Bekish Ish Yemini, is the same Mamer. The difference is that Zachor is 4 pages, and Ish Yehudi is 7 pages. Because the Mamer Ish Yehudi has the same 4 pages, more or less, 5 pages, 4.5 pages of this Zachor Mamer that we're about to learn, and then it has a new Haschala and a Siyum, which speaks about a different Inyan, the Inyan of Tefillah, as it relates to Raishis Goyim Amalaik, as I'll tell you in a moment, which we'll bleed out to discuss this coming Friday, Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach, when I'm going to do that Mamer, according to the regular Seder of the Limud of Maimorim that we do, as a part of the project, the wish, the ambition of Inside Chassidus.org to teach every single one of the Maimorim of the Rebbe. Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach, Bli Neder, or Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach V'Yisala. This is a Mamer of Raishis Goyim Amalaik. That's what it is. We all know the story of Raishis Goyim Amalaik. I mean, Maimorim Raishis Goyim go back to the earlier Rabbeim. But the Mamer of Maimorim, the most famous Mamer Raishis Goyim Amalaik, is the Mamer that the Rebbe Rashab said, Purim Tafresh Pei. And of course, the Mamer was connected to events that were happening at that time. That the Bolsheviks, the communists had come into Rostov in Tevis. I'm assuming that means January 1920. And the Rebbe Rashab said, I cannot cohabit with them, I can't handle them. And the mood in the Beis Harav was quite depressed. Depressed in the sense that it was very quiet, very withdrawn, not shturmdik, as is the tradition beklal by Yidden, especially by Chassidim, especially by Beseidin Nisiyenu. Even Purim was quite depressed, because there was martial law. You were not allowed to gather in large groups, you were not allowed to be out at night, you were not allowed to raise money, you were not allowed to drink alcohol, and you were not allowed to make noise. And a Purim Fabrengid was every one of those crimes put together, for each of which you could, Rahman al-Hassan, have lost your life, because it wasn't a civil militia that was overseeing Rostov, it was military law, martial law, which is very, very different rules, of course. So the Fabrengid started very, very quiet. And at midnight, suddenly the Rebbe Rashab turns to his son, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he says, he called him by his full name. I have the same name, so I allow myself to say it. Yosef Yitzchak, Simchas Teira b'mirzach avdem nish gericht. Ich will as ist es sein wie Simchas Teira. He called him by his name, And he said, Simchas Torah, we didn't anticipate this. We didn't see this coming. I want you to now be like Simchas Torah. And he said to bring mashke, and to bring a plate, and to raise money for Kupas Rabbeinu, and that the Chassidim should sing loud, and make a shturim, dik a lebedik, a purim fabringen. The Chassidim cooperated. The Chassidim got into it. And the Frierdiker Rebbe panicked. Went into a total panic. He didn't stop his father, but he was in a state of panic. And it's quite obvious that the Frierdiker Rebbe panicked because he understood the ramifications. He understood what his father was saying, that this was it, this was the Estalkas. So the police were called, and the KGB came, whatever, the Sektia came, a couple of agents came, and they were yeshiva bachrim, ex-yeshiva bachrim, who had gone away from Yiddishkeit completely. They were very, very bitter against religion, to a point of a religious hatred against religion. And they could have done terrible damage to the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab Pashat began to make fun of them. They stood opposite him in the room, and he mocked them, he put them down. The Berel Rifkin, who tells the story, writes, Azul Sumka v'asa chivra, v'asal Sumka. They turned red and they turned white. The Rebbe Rashab was really treating them as if they were not people. And the end was that he finally said, they'll disappear altogether. And the Rebbe Rashab said, the Mamer is Goyim Amalaik, v'achari said the Avid. The expectation was that the next day there'd be arrests. They'd come and they'd arrest the Rebbe, and nothing happened. Nothing. Gunish, which was a pelagol. That Shabbos, the Rebbe said a Mamer from Pashas Kisisa, Bris, of which we have half, B'ksav Yad Kotcher of the Rebbe Rashab, and the Hanocha, a complete Hanocha from the Frierdiker Rebbe, and they're both printed. And he spent that entire week writing his Zachor. He had asked for Sfarim because he had no books with him. He asked for Sfarim. They went and they brought him Sfarim from another city. The Zachor, the will of the Rebbe Rashab, is very scholarly and very long and has never been seen by anybody, except for one page, which are the instructions that the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe about continuing Taim Chetmimim and saying Chassidus, and continuing the efforts that had started after the First World War about strengthening Minhagi Chabad and Kehillas Chabad all over Russia, which was a resurgence that had started in Tafresh Ches in many cities. It was a very successful undertaking that in many cities that they should get together to learn Chassidus, L'Kutei Torah every Friday night, and they should have Shalosh Shudas, and they should Chazar Chassidus, and they should have Malava Malkus, and they should make Fabreng, and it was a whole Ta'amula, a whole effort, which of course had a lot to do with the Tmimim that was started after the First World War. And the Rebbe told his son to continue all these projects. Unfortunately, within a year or two, the mandate that his father gave him was made secondary by the need to worry about basic Yiddishkeit, mikveh tara, chinuch of children, and things like this, as we all know the history of that generation and that time. Now it's over 100 years ago. The Rebbe Rashab passed away. Say 1 week he wrote a Zachor. Then Friday night, the following Shabbos, which I guess was a Yaakov Pekude, he didn't feel well. Berel Rifkin got up in the middle of the night and he saw the Rebbetzin, who they called her then Musya, going at 2 o'clock in the morning with a glass of tea, and he asked her, "Was geshen?" What happened? And she said, "The felt nicht gut. The Rebbe Rashab is not feeling well." And he was sick from that Friday night until the following Motzei Shabbos, when he was nistalik. At 2 or 3 in the morning, the famous last words were, "Ich gehe in Himmel. Und ich salve lazik mit euch. Nehmt mir in Saal, weil wir seid in einem." And of course, the Rebbe spoke about this so many times. And Chav Cheshvan, I'm going into the Himmel, into the sky, into the heavens, and I'm leaving the Chassidus with you. So the Rebbe would explain that in the Chassidus you have the Rebbe himself. Take me into the Zal, take me into the Shula, we'll be all together. Where the Rebbe Rashab was nostalgic, he was surrounded by his Talmidim, by the Tmim, which were very important to him, and they were very great. This was Sunday, Motzei Shabbos to Sunday. The Levi was obviously the next day. He was buried in Rostov. And in case you're not aware, 20 years after the Estalkos of the Rebbe Rashab, his Guf Kodesh had to be moved because they were building a road. And the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Leivik, who was the Rav in Yekaterinslav and the Rebbe Petrovsk, was one of the Rabbonim who oversaw the halacha side of this event of Pini Atzomis. And of course, when they moved him, they moved several Chassidim with him, like Reb Shmuel Gerari. And his Guf Kodesh was completely whole, just the way he was buried. There was not a tiny little mark on the talis, I think, and that was it. After 20 years. There was actually a svara to move him to Eretz Yisrael. The Frierdiker Rebbe had a svara to move him to Eretz Yisrael, which is another parsha. I don't know much about it, but I know that there was such a consideration and the efforts were made in that direction. The following Shabbos was Tav. So the Shiva, if the Levi was on Sunday, so the Shiva ended on Shabbos. So in the afternoon, the Rebbe called in Beryl Rifkin, the same Mechaber of the Sefer Ashkafta the Rebbe, and he said to him very humbly and very brokenly that my father told me that I should say Chassidus, and I don't feel worthy, so I'm going to say Chassidus to you, and that'll be Yetzer Zayin, I'll fulfill my obligation. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said the Mamer Reishis Goyim Amalaik v'Acharis Yad Yevid, which was the same Mamer his father had said 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks and 2 days before, on Purim. And they paced in the office. They paced in the Rebbe Rayat's Frierdiker Rebbe's cabinet, they called it, the office. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said the Mamer Reishis Goyim Amalaik verbatim, word for word, as his father had said it. And he would interject biur as he went, commentary from time to time. Beryl Rifkin, who was all of a bocher, felt very, very uncomfortable that the Rebbe Rayatz is saying Chassidus just to him, because he understood that the Frierdiker Rebbe is a royal, he's worthy of taking his father's place. So as they were walking back and forth, the door was opened, and Shmuel Gerari poked his head in, and he motioned to the Shmuel to come into the room, so he was also there. So at least there were two, maybe there was a third person. The Frierdiker Rebbe became Rebbe when his father was Nistalik without any interruption. There was mamish one hemshech. It happened right away. And this is the story. But this Mamer, Reishis Goyim Amalaik, is a very important Mamer, because it talks about the destruction of Klipas Amalek, and that Amalek is Chutzpa. Chutzpa b'loi taga, b'loi toga, as the Rebbe says. It's chus without a crown. It's fighting against Kedusha, not because it has an explanation for its objection to Kedusha. To the contrary, they know and they understand what Kedusha is. They just cannot tolerate Kedusha. And their fight is a fight without any principle, without any rhyme or reason, without any justification. It's pure evil, pure disrespect. And that's why they have to be destroyed at the Yevid. Amalek. My hergish is that the whole hanhog of the Rebbe Rashab, that Purim, to be mevatel the klipa, which was a klipa that wasn't his beater, it was his son's beater. V'haraya, he was nostalgic and he left it for his son. By him being mevatel the Soviets, the way he did, he softened their teikif. And it explains why they didn't come and arrest him, because they had no hand on him beklal, just on the Rebbe Rayatz. This beater was the Frierdiker Rebbe's, and by tzaddikim, their involvement in this yoyness is because of avodah, not because of choshech, not because of helam. So since it was not his beater, they couldn't touch him. And by him being mavatal them, he gave a takeif to the Rebbe Rayatz to be able to fight and defeat him. This is the story of the Mamer Ketzam L'Cheshach. The nekud of the Mamer is that klipa could be a mix of good and bad. When klipa is a mix of good and bad, you try to fix the good. And when you fix the good, you redeem it. Amalek is pure evil. And not only is Amalek pure evil, Amalek nourishes the evil of the other klipas that are a mix of good and bad and makes them more disposed towards pure evil. So of all the nations of the world, Amalek has to be completely wiped out. That's what this Maimid is about. Reishis Goyim Amalek v'Acharis Yad Yevid. But it's not just Reishis Goyim Amalek v'Acharis Yad Yevid. There's more to the Maimid. The more to the Maimid is that there's two concepts in erasing Amalek. One is a spiritual one and one is an actual one. The actual process of erasing Amalek has very, very specific rules. You can only erase Amalek after a king is appointed. And the king defeats Amalek, and after Amalek is defeated, then you can build a Beis HaMikdash. So not everybody can come up today and say, okay, I'm going to go kill Amalek. There are very specific rules. Sholish mitzvahs and stavi yisrael mishnichnasu la'aretz, limneis aleha melech, lahachre zari shal Amalek, and livneis beis habechir. It has to be done in that order. But then there's another thing. There's the spiritual mitzvah saseh of Zachor, remembering Amalek, and the spiritual mitzvah sleis sasav lei tishkach, you're not allowed to forget Amalek. And this is always, and it's even for the individual. The Maimon is going to address both of these ideas, how the practical erasure of Amalek has very, very strict rules, but the philosophical erasure of Amalek and remembering the erasing of Amalek is a constant. And the Rebbe is going to focus on several points beginning with the idea of remembrance itself. To fight Amalek, you have to remember. Fighting of Amalek has to be dafka from Shem Havaya, and fighting of Amalek is only after you have a king spiritually. And the union of a melech, as you'll see in the Mamer, is Bittul and Kabbalah Sel, because you want to fight a klipa that doesn't have anything redeeming about himself, doesn't have any pretense, doesn't want to look good, doesn't care to be able to justify his hatred, his evil, but is simply want and hate. Chutzpa b'leitage, it's only defeated with a hardness and akshonis of kedusha. And that's what this Mamer is going to discuss. Several different points, including the idea of Zachor, to remember that they are the hardness that is necessary to defeat the klipas Amalek. And of course, the Rebbe is going to focus primarily not on the actual physical erasing of Amalek, but the spiritual and ongoing struggle with Amalek, which is not just in every generation, but it's in every individual person. So we start from the beginning. The first page is Zachor, and on the second page is Raishis Goyim Amalek. But like I said to you before, in the Mamer Purim, the Rebbe is going to say both of these things. He's going to speak about Raishis Goyim and he's going to speak about Zachor. He's going to move the ideas around, but the middle of the next Mamer is very similar to this Mamer. I think if the Rebbe would say his voice, he would say that he said the same Mamer twice, but that at Purim he added a new haschal of a siyam of Ish Yehudi. They are not identical. There's significant differences, but they're basically the same. So the Rebbe begins, it's a mitzvah, say that I said to remember always what Amalek did. And then it finishes, even though the mitzvah is to remember Amalek always, but to actually erase Amalek, you have to have very, very specific conditions. That Hashem spares you from all of your enemies from around. Then there's a mitzvah of Timcha, as Zachor Amalek, you have to erase the memory of Amalek from beneath the heavens. You're not allowed to forget. So on the one hand, it's a constant mitzvah. And this constant mitzvah includes both the mitzvah say of Zachor and the mitzvah say of Tishkach. And on the other hand, it's a practical mitzvah which has many preconditions. And the question is obvious. There's an obvious contradiction between the beginning of this pasuk and the end of this pasuk. Because the beginning of the pasuk is you have to remember Amalek Zachor Stam. There are no preconditions to remembering to erase Amalek. There are no conditions, not conditions in space. No conditions in time. So always, in all times, in all places, you have to remember the erasure of Amalek. Especially when you look in those mefarshim that say that the meaning of the word Zachor, the Hebrew word Zachor, means Lashon Heva, that it's a constant thing. It's every minute there's a chiyuv to remember to erase Amalek. Hameid ala Tmidis, which shows on constancy. It shows on perpetuity, on ever present. The commandment to remember to erase Amalek is a mitzvah which applies every minute. At every time. So it's not bound by any other rules. But in the very same pasuk, he says, only when the Eibishter spares Yidden from the enemies around them, then becomes the actual mitzvah of erasing Amalek. And the Rebbe translates, the idea. It is a mitzvah to say to kill out every member of Amalek, man, woman, and child. And in the story of Shaul, he even told him to kill the animals. It's dafka la'achet, it's only after after the Eibishter takes away all other enemies of the Jewish people. So the question is that in the Chumash, they say that there's a constant mitzvah of Zachor, and on the other hand, the very same pasuk says that there's preconditions to erasing Amalek. And just like you have this kasha from the pasuk, you also have this kasha from the Gemara. And the question is asked a second time. When the Gemara says, the Jewish people given 3 mitzvahs. Once they came into Eretz Yisrael, the first one is lahamed lahamelech, they must have a king first. And only afterwards, can they erase the memory of Amalek and the seed of Amalek. And of course, you would like to add, after you have a king, you have to get rid of all your other enemies. That's what the pasuk says. And only then can you erase Amalek, and only afterwards livnis lahem beis habechira, to build a beis hamikdash. Harei, says the Rebbe, it's not only that you can't erase Amalek until you have no enemies, but you cannot erase Amalek until you appoint a king. Mechias Amalek tzarich liyas dafka, the erasure of Amalek physically cannot happen until la'achar mini Amalek, once they appoint a king. So the question is, both from the pasuk on the pasuk and the pasuk on the Gemara, or the Gemara on the pasuk, is it a mitzvah tmidis, or is it a mitzvah that has many preconditions? And of course the answer is going to be that Beruchnius, it's constant, and actually it has rules. Another question is this idea that the Jews have to wipe out a nation, and not just have to wipe out a nation, they have to keep it in their cognizance all the time to remember that there's a nation called Amalek that they have to wipe out. It's only by Amalek. Any other nation which has done pain and damage and suffering to the Jewish people, there's no chiyuv to erase them off the face of the earth, like there was a chiyuv to waste Amalek off the face of the earth. And the question is, behold, every day in every generation, Yisrael Jews are attacked. You see the constant attacks that the Jewish people suffered from the Plishtim and from Aram and from Ashur and from Mitzrayim and from Bavel and from who else? Who not? And as they traveled from Egypt towards Eretz Yisrael, Amalek was not the only nation that attacked, like it says in the Pasuk. They were attacked by Knaanim, and of course in Rashi it says that the Knaanim is Amalek, which seems to undermine the Rebbe's argument. So the Rebbe puts in the footnote that the Gemara says that Knani means a different people. The Rebbe wrote this, even though Mamer is Bilti Mugad, the Rebbe wrote this footnote that the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah that Knani means literally people of Canaan, which is not Amalek, which includes Sichon and Oig. V'cheinatzas Bilam, the council of Bilam, which destroyed many Jews not with weapons of war but with weapons of sin and of Avodah Zarah v'chuli. As we say, and every single generation people stand up against us to wipe us out, and it's only because the Kodesh Baruch Hu Hashem saves us. So why is there no obligation to wipe out any nation which has been a tormentor of Jewish people like Amalek was? The question becomes the mitzvah of remembering to erase Amalek and not forgetting to erase Amalek, and actually under the right conditions. And after Mini Melech, there's a mitzvah of wiping out Amalek, killing Amalek, bepashtas. Why is it rak lagabi Amalek? Why is it only by Amalek? There's a third question. What's the significance of remembering what Amalek did? In other words, that you have to put it in your memory. You have to hold it in the place of Zachor. The question is, the reason to remember Amalek is in order to protect yourself against what Amalek does. He meets the Jewish people on the road, and he chances upon them, he surprises them, and he attacks them. Or as Chassidus explains it, and you'll see it in the Mamer later, he tries to cool the Jewish people down to make them uninspired. When the Pasuk says remember what Amalek did, it should say what? Remember what Amalek did, which is Havana v'Asaga, the Havana v'Asbara, a logic and an explanation, which is remember what Amalek did, that it cooled you off. And the focus should not be on remembering, the focus should be on protecting yourself against allowing Amalek to do it to you again. And the question is, why is the focus on remembering? Meaning, you have to wipe out Amalek because Amalek is bad. You have to wipe out Amalek because Amalek is bad, and Amalek was bad to you, to us. The reason Amalek, the way in which Amalek was bad to us is called Asher Karcha, which means he attacks you when you're not ready. He tries to cool off your passions from Avodas Hashem, and you have to kill Amalek for these reasons. So when you talk about remembering Amalek, the key is not remembering the people, it's remembering what they did. It's remembering their negative effect on you, which is the reason we have the mitzvah of wiping them out. But Pasuk seems to be focusing simply on remembering them. There's not an emphasis on the why we have to wipe out Amalek, simply on the that we have to wipe out Amalek. And that's the Rebbe's question, I think. The remembrance is not connected to what Amalek does, which explains why we have to wipe them out, but simply that you have to wipe out Amalek. That's what the word Zachor connotes, and the Rebbe wants to understand this. And after all of these three questions, the Rebbe makes a statement. And the statement is sort of the beginning of the answer. The three questions that we just asked. A, is erasing Amalek a constant mitzvah? Does it require certain specific criteria? B, why is it only Amalek that we have to erase? C, when we talk about remembering to erase Amalek, we don't focus on the reason, but simply that they're Amalek. Says the Rebbe, these three questions itself lend themselves to the following truth. What we can take out of these three questions is as follows. Move, we understand the following. Number one, the first thing is you have to remember. And the remembering Amalek not only has no preconditions, but it has to be right away. With the focus not on why Amalek has to be wiped out, but that you have to remember Amalek, on the remembrance aspect. And of course the Rebbe is going to explain this in the Mamer. Then you have Ve'ina Minyan Melech, you have to appoint a king. And once you appoint a king, can you actually physically wipe out Amalek? We have to understand two questions. Why can you not wipe out Amalek actually till you appoint a king? And why is remembering Amalek, just for the sake of remembering Amalek, something which doesn't have any limitations of time, even though the actual erasing of Amalek has many preconditions? But that's the deal. The spiritual erasing of Amalek is constant and it's connected to Zachor and Leit Tishkach. And the actual erasing of Amalek has many preconditions. But even the actual erasing of Amalek and its preconditions has an explanation. I'll see this as well, as you'll see in this Maimon. Now we turn the page to 352 and we read Raishis Goyim Amalek, which the way I introduced this Maimon. To understand this, you have to explain which is explained in many Maimorim. And he's mitzayin to Reish Mem Zayin and a teres in Taf Reish Peyalef and Taf Reish Peyhei and Taf Shintes. And then of course in the other 7 and 8 there are additional Maramekemis, including the Siddur and Taf Reish Samachei, and the Ikir is Taf Reish Pei, both from the Rebbe Rashab and from the Frierdiker Rebbe, Raishis Goyim Amalek v'Charis Yadi Yevid. Ala Pasuk, on the Pasuk Raishis Goyim Amalek, the first of all the Goyim is Amalek. V'Charis, and the end of Amalek is that the Yevid is until they're completely wiped off the face of the earth, totally. I just want to mention that we started yesterday in Rambam Mechodesh. Yesterday was Shabbos Eshchedish Oder, Aleph Oder, and Tafresh. So we started the 45th cycle, Machzer Hama 45, which was the Hakdam of the Rambam. Today we're doing Mitzvah Sasei Mitzvah Hashem. So 2 or 3 days before we learned Hilchas Malachim u'Melchamis, and he speaks about wiping out or not marrying into Moav and Amail and not to call them for Shalom, all these different halachas. And he writes, those nations no longer exist because they're gone from the face of the earth. But this, and the mitzvah of not being Pesach b'Shalom to Amail and Moav no longer applies because they don't any longer exist. If you read the language of the Rambam, it's not explicit that the Rambam holds about Amalek that it's the same thing, that they're gone from the face of earth, and therefore there's no mitzvah to wipe them out. And it's curious because for the same reason there's no Amail and Moav, there should not be any Amalek, because called the Parish, Meruba Parish, and all the nations were made to move, and they were assimilated. So the average Goy is part of the Roiv. That's not Amalek, that's not Amail, and that's not Moav. They're just like there's no Issa to be Pesach Shalom to a Goy, because no Goy is presumed to be Amail and Moav, because we go Basarev. By Amalek, the Rambam is a little bit less explicit, and I'm very curious about it, and I'm sure that Rambam knew what he was doing. We just don't know what the Rambam was doing. But that's homework. But an halacha have to be wiped off the face of the earth. And the Memorim explained the Liyetza Amalek is going precisely because he's the first of the Goyim. That's why his end has to be until they're destroyed completely. Now let's talk frankly. The 70 nations were formed after the Mabel. That's when the 70 languages developed. And the 70 nations are the 70 names of Shem, Chom, and Yafes found in Parshas Noach. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan in his Chumash, they called it Living Torah, came out in the 80s, brings from the Targum Shivim, from the Septuagint. And McKen Cledden, you can wonder, is it correct or incorrect to use Targum Shivim? Targum Shivim was not written with the Ratzon of the Gedei Yisrael. It was Kiyem Shechar Beis HaMikdash. It's considered a very, very bad day when the Torah was translated into Yavanis, even though Moshe Rabbeinu had already translated the Torah into 70 languages in the Midbar. So the Rebbe explains in Sichas, because that was done by Moshe Rabbeinu's choice, this was done by coercion. So you cannot trust Targum Shivim. But on the other hand, Does it mean you're not allowed to look at it? Does it mean that everything about it is false? Or just the handful of examples that the Gemara brings, that they were Mishane, they were in 70 different rooms, 7 different Chachamim in 70 different rooms, and nevertheless they all made the same tikkunim, including the one about our Nevis, v'chuli, and Elikim Bar Raishis, as we all know. So, but he looked in the Targum Shivim, and he identifies each one of the 70 nations, based on the Greek translation of these psukim in Parshas Neach. Those are the 70 nations. And he made a map of the ancient world, and he writes where he surmises, he's trying to guess where each one of the 70 nations it was. I mean, Ari Kaplan was a genius, a real genius. So he's using the Targum Shivim's labels for the 70 nations and what we know from history to try and put together where they lived. But the 70 nations all existed before Avraham Avinu was born. The Jews are considered the 71st nation, and we were born 10 generations later. And Amalaik is a grandson of Esav. So he's even later. So Amalaik is like a late comer to the game. He's not one of the 70 nations of Goyim. And the Pasuk calls him Raishis, which is historically quite strange. It's not much less strange than calling the Yidden Reish L'chol Goyim, even though the Yidden were the last ones to come along, where Ma'at Mikol Amim, we came much later, 10 generations later. But Amalaik is even later than Yidden, L'havl. So what is the meaning of Raishis Goyim Amalaik? And of course the answer is it doesn't mean that it's the beginning of Goyim biologically and socially, the beginning of Goyim spiritually. And he explains, we know the word Raishis means can be explained in two ways. Pirush Al, the first meaning of Raishis is that it's the first. You have a whole bunch of nations, and the first is Amalaik. There's many points. In this case, many nations. And the first of those nations would be Amalaik. It is only Shehu Harishis Shabenem is the first of many. In other words, Raishis means the first. But we also find Pirush Abayz, another translation, that the Raishis is Bechutza Lehem. The Raishis means the source of the 70 nations, but actually he's before them. And I wrote on the margin the dugma from the Gemara Masechta Pesachim that speaks about Bayem Rishon Tashbisas Erev Batechem. On the first day, you have to get rid of chametz. And Bayem Rishon means Erev Pesach. Rishon can make a mashma before Pesach. So you have a mocker for the idea that the word Raishis or Roish doesn't have to mean the first; it can mean the source, and it's even before the first. That the beginning is not one of them; he's outside of them, and he's before them. In this pasuk, Raishis Goyim Amalaik, it's Keifan Abayz that follows the second idea. Begoyim, who the 70 Goyim means the Shivim Umas, the 70 nations. And Amalaik is not one of them, because Amalaik, even though he chronologically lived much later, he is the Raishis Goyim Amalaik in the sense that he's the source of all Goyim and Goyishkeit, but he's removed from them. He's even worse than they are. And then he says something interesting. The 70 nations are Kulusam Zayin. Even though there's 70 nations, but it's 7 times 10, there's 7 midas rise, and each one has broken up into 10. So the original 7 nations, the ones that were in Eretz Yisrael, the Knani, Chiti, Mamer, Chivi, Goshen, and Yevusi, are the 7 nations which are the source of the 70 nations. Shemehem Mistaf Mashem Umis, which the 70 nations form. And in the next Mamer, the Rebbe is going to use more words to explain this. Amalek is not amongst the 70 nations, and he's also not amongst the 70 nations. You must say, Shapir, the Raishis Goyim Amalaik, when you identify Amalaik as the first, as the head of all the nations. It's Keif and Abayz, it's like the second approach. And what is the second approach? Amalaik is outside of the 70 nations because he's Bein Harechlam, he's far more than them. Far more than them in his power, and far more than them in his evil. And it's this idea that Amalaik is the source of the 70 nations, plus the idea that he's not amongst them, which is why we have to erase them. Because the nations of the world, which are klipa, as I said earlier, are a mix of good and bad. There's something to fix, something to redeem. When they hate, they come up with an excuse for why they hate. They want to be righteous. They want to be seen as good. So they come up with some kind of a pretense. It's a lie, it's a bluff, but at least they care to be seen as good. Amalaik is Pashat Chutzpa. He doesn't care anything. He's just evil. And then the Rebbe says, let's explain it in Avodas Adam. I'm sort of going to jump in right here and say that since the actual mitzvah of erasing Amalek, Begashmias, has the criteria that we said before, it has to be done by a tzibur, and it can only be done after a melech is appointed, as you'll see in more detail in the Purim Mamer. So since the mitzvah cannot be done literally now, and actually now we can talk about the ruchnias dika mitzvah of erasing Amalek, which is always, and the beginning of that is the word Zachor, as we discussed before. And I'm going to say these words, since we can't actually erase Amalek, so we can only speak of erasing Amalek in spiritual terms. So what is the spiritual concept of erasing Amalek? Begins the Rebbe and he says, the 7 nations are 7 midas of klipa. They're emotions, love, fear, beauty or joy, determination, stubbornness, connectivity, and action of klipa. And each one of them has an aspect that's redeemable. The feeling of love can be turned around for loving good things rather than loving things which are going to hurt me or somebody else. And the same is true of fear, the same is true of beauty and joy, and so on. When our work is to correct these emotions, not to destroy the emotions, take the good out of the midas of klipa, turn them towards kedusha, and then the bad is going to go away. But it's only the correction of the midas of klipa, not the moichen of klipa. Of course, we know this from the Rebbe's constantly referring to the Mamer al Totzaras Moyev from the Mittler Rebbe, which the Mittler Rebbe said to Rabbi Kiva Eger. Somebody told me it was to Rabbi Banet, but he said it to one of the great Gedolim of Germany. And I think it says it was Rabbi Kiva Eger. And the toichen of that Mamer is that now we have to be mevarer only the midas. We can't be mevarer moichen until after Mashiach comes. That's why we were only given the 7 lands and not the 10 lands, and we're not going to get the 10 lands till Mashiach comes when we're able to be mevarer moichen as well. And that's what the Rebbe is going to say here. But the key point is, number 1, we're mevarer the midas, and number 2, mevarer the midas only. But we could uplift the midas. This is the fact, our conquest of Eretz Yisrael before Mashiach comes. It's Kov Shuraketz Eretz Sheva Amim, and they took on the land of the 7 nations, Knani, Chiti, Amedi, Prizi, Yoshi, Chivi, Yevusi. And Kaini, Kizi, Vekadmai, they did not get. And we're only going to have the Masidim, Liyas, Yerushalayim, also we're going to inherit them only after Mashiach comes. The 3 lands, which is really Amin and Moav, Lot's children, and Edom, which is Esav. We're only going to get to when Mashiach comes, and geographically, if you look on the maps, it's southeast of Eretz Yisrael. It's where the bottom of Jordan would be in Saudi Arabia, the southeast of Eretz Yisrael. Northeast of Eretz Yisrael, which was the lands of Sich and Noig, which is where Jordan is and where Syria is, we took historically. They're part of the 7 nations. But the southern part of that area, which you have to circle around because we're not allowed to intimidate and provoke Moav and Ammon, we're going to get after Mashiach comes, but only then. Because these 3 nations represent the klipa of the mind. And nowadays we cannot refine the mind of klipa and make it into a mind of kedusha. We're only able to refine the heart of klipa and make it into the heart of kedusha. That's why we're given 7 nations, representing, symbolizing our ability to elevate the 7 midas and not the gimel moich. Kemavur betanya, like it's explained in Tanya. If you look in footnote 12, footnote 11, there's no mucker. He's mitzayin to a Mamer for the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe. But the idea that now we're only mevarer midas, kemavur betanya, I don't know where it is in Tanya. I really don't know where it is in Tanya. I wrote on the margin Tezayin and Yud Zayin, because in those 2 prakim, the Alter Rebbe goes even further. The Alter Rebbe says that the bitter hamidas nowadays has only been a gel ma'aser. In other words, not only are we not mevarer moichen, we don't even need to be mevarer midas for themselves. We need to be mevarer midas enough to affect behavior. Perhaps that's what the Rebbe is alluding to. Otherwise, it's a tzarachi and godel. Where in Tanya do you have this idea that before Mashiach comes, you could only be mevarer midas, and after Mashiach comes, you're going to be mevarer moichen. And he continues and he says, in order for us to correct emotions, you have to engage your mind. Because what your mind is able to do is direct your emotions in a direction which is positive rather than a direction which is negative. The mind can arouse the heart and it can also direct the heart. Like it says in Tanya, here it says pay the gimel in footnote 12, which is accurate. Shaydei is bonus begedulos havaya only when one thinks about the greatness of Hashem, like you have in Hilchis Yesed Yateda in the beginning of Perek Beis and at the end of Perek Daled, and then again at the end of Hilchis Tshuva, Perek Yud. Shaydei is bonus begedulos Hashem only when you use your mind to contemplate the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Can you arouse the midas of Hashem and Yiras Hashem? And one contemplates intellectually the greatness of Hashem, and because of that intellectual contemplation, he redirects his heart. He turns a love which is until then alien, meaning he's involved in loving things which are foreign to a Jew, Hashem, to loving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that will be the midah, the beater of the midah ra of avazara, to be an ava going towards Kedusha. And of course, if you wanted to add the idea of Harav Tfues B'Keach Sheir, that the animal emotions are actually stronger than the divine emotions, this would add another dimension to Avodas Hashem. But the bottom line is, the midas can be mavura, they can be corrected. And the nations are the midas, so we can correct and elevate all of the nations. We don't have to wipe them out, chas v'shalom. The same is true of the emotion associated with fear. There could be negative fear, and you have to turn it into positive fear. And the same is true with high spoilers made of boasting and showing off and bluff. That can be turned around and used for Kedusha. The same is true with the other emotions. Like Netzach, Hesed, and Malchus, Anafim, we tell the same. The branches of Chagas and their offspring, you could be mavad all 7 midas, but the beater of the midas depends on the moichin. And that's the pshat in Pasuk, which is also mentioned in Tanya, that the mother with the children together are joyous. The mother is Bina, is understanding. And the sons are the midas. And when the mind is used to engage the heart, there's joy. When we contemplate in our understanding, which is called mother, the sons, which means the human emotions, become the kind of way they bring joy to Bina, because it's a beater. You're uplifting it. So all the midas, of klipa, which correspond to all the nations of the world, have good in them. It's in klipa, but there's a good aspect. And that good aspect needs to be redirected towards Kedusha, and then you uplift them, you don't have to destroy them. But he adds, we just said that the beater nowadays is only midas, not moichin. And in almost in the same breath we said, but in order to mevada midas, you have to have moichin. So which is it? Is it that you don't have the ability to mevada moichin nowadays, or that you must have moichin in order to mevada midas? And the answer is simple. The fact that we use our mind to correct the emotions nowadays is not the mind as it is by itself. It's the mind which is connected to the heart. Which is necessary now is it's not contemplating the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as an entity unto itself. And also the idea of correcting the mind is going to be after Mashiach comes, and then we're going to learn Chabad just for the sake of Chabad, like the Rebbe spoke Takatov Shin Beis. I think it's in Parshas Lech Lecha that there's an Inyan Meichem B'Yetzim, and the Rebbe implied that we're already holding by that Madrege. But classically, when Chassidus talks about using your mind to be mevada the midas, it's so much mind, which is necessary to elevate the emotions, but it's not the moichin by itself. The amount of mind needed to be mevada the midas is the part of the mind which is going to affect the heart. The amount of understanding and contemplation which is necessary to bring correction to the emotions. That when one contemplates intellectually the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu beater midas, he corrects the midas. First you suppress the negative midas, which is the madrega of Beinani. And then you transform them, which is the madrega of tzaddik. So of course you're engaging the mind to correct the heart, but you're only engaging the mind to the extent that is necessary to correct the heart, which is quite limited. This explains why most Goyim are not going to be chas v'shalom destroyed when Mashiach comes, but they're going to be transformed. The exception is Amalaik, that because he's Raishis Goyim, he's above the Goyim and he's the source of their evil, as you'll see inside. That's why Yachari say Adei Eved has to be until Adei means like Ad, until Eved have to be wiped out completely. Omnam Klipas Amalaik, the exception to this rule of being Mavader Klipa, the 70 nations, by using the mind to correct and redirect the heart, is true of all the other nations which represent the 7 midas, how each one is included in 10, how each one has 10 levels within it. But Klipas Amalaik is different. Amalaik cannot be corrected through contemplation. Amalek cannot be negotiated with. Amalek needs to be crushed. The idea of Amalek is Chutzpa, Malchus Abletag. It's a Chutzpa, a kingdom without a crown. Meaning, Amalek is not a bad midah. He loves, but he loves the wrong thing. He fears, and he fears in the wrong way. He beautifies and decorates and adorns, but it covers over a lie, as are the other midas. Amalek says, I hate you. And there's no pretense, there's no trying to make believe that he's a good guy. He hates out and out, period. And as you'll see inside, it's not just that he hates out and out. He knows exactly what he's hating. But Rebbe's going to break it down. He understands Teda, he understands Emes, and he's fighting against it with the highest level of spite imaginable. If the Amalek is the hardness of Amalek is mitzad ezaz, but Amalek doesn't hate because he has an explanation that because he's so loving, he therefore has to be angry at Yisrael because they want to defend themselves against people trying to destroy them. Because he's so concerned with the law, he screams about occupation, those kinds of things. Amalek is an out and out hater of Jews. He says, I'm going to fight to the death. Finished. Amalek is Malchus Abletag. Amalek is a kingdom that has no crown. She'ein le'keser v'atorah has no crown, meaning he has no pretense, has no decoration, no form that is used to make his presentation of his evil more palpable. He just hates out and out. Even the mind of Amalek, Amalek is smart. And the mind of Amalek cannot explain or give a reason for why he hates so much and why he has to destroy the Jewish nation. Moreover, not only cannot he explain why he wants to do it, but exactly the opposite. And he understands that logically it should be the opposite of what he's doing. He understands the good of Yid. So first of all, there's no logic to his evil. Second of all, he actually logically understands that he's wrong. He understands that he's wrong, and nevertheless he does it because he's a chutzpahnik. Number 3, he understands the Eibishter. And he's rebelling against the Eibishter wantonly, in spite, with a full understanding of how correct the Eibishter is. So there's 4 points. Number 1, there's no logic to his anhaga. Number 2, he knows that he's wrong. Number 3, he knows that the Eibishter is right. And number 4, his anger and his hate against the Eibishter is against all logic. It's just spite. Because he knows godliness. He knows that godliness is his master. The Eibishter is his balabos. Who made it, rebels against him. His rebellion is with intent to be avoided. I gave the shir yesterday in the oil. We went for Shabbos to the oil with a group of balabatim. So I gave the shir of the Mamer of Purim, Ishuhudi, which, as I told you before, the same Mamer. So I gave the dugma that about 12, 13 years ago, there was one occasion when there was attacks from Gaza. They sent 4,000 rockets. And as always, they always do it during the 3 weeks. And there were Nisim Goyim, unbelievable miracles. And the world was saying that their rockets are faulty. They're just very bad manufacturers of rockets, which is probably true also. He said, no, our rockets are perfect. And the rockets are being aimed in the right places and they're being shot with the right trajectory and all the other things. But their God is pushing them off course. It was a headline in the USA Today. Their God is pushing it off course. So I ask you a question. If you know that the God of the Jews is fighting for them, Hashem Yelochem Lechem V'atam Tacharish, maybe pick somebody else to pick on. Why are you going to fight with a nation that you yourself admit that their God is fighting beside them? Are you going to defeat the Eibishter? What's the teretz? He knows that when he starts up with the Jew, he's starting up with the Eibishter. And he knows that starting up with the Eibishter is a suicide plan. He cannot win. But he doesn't care. He's going to fight to the death for some kind of a stupid principle. That kind of an enemy you can't negotiate and reason with. You have to kill him. You have to destroy him. When we call them move, and this explains. When it comes to the clip of Amalek, you can't be reasonable. You can't discuss it. As it is with the other 7 nations, that they're corrected by using your mind to contemplate the Eibishter, to redirect the love to a good love, redirect the fear to a positive fear, and so on. Amalek already, whatever you're going to teach him, he knows already. But Mikolma came who mischaven limit by his rebellion against Eibush that is spiteful. So there's no point in having any conversations. You have to crush him. And like the old expression is, the snake has to be crushed, hit in the head. V'zehu Raishis Goyim Amalek. That's why Amalek is called the first of all the Goyim, and he's before them. Shapir is Bereishis Goyim. The mean that Amalek is the first of the Goyim, even though historically he's, 15 or 16 generations after the Mabel, is Amalaik u'michutz la'goyim kanal Amalek is outside the other nations. He's called la'goyim efshel levarara ma'dei bonus. All the other nations can be corrected through contemplation. And Amalek is chutzpa b'li taga Amalek is chutzpa without any crown. And efshel levarara, there's no way to correct them ma'dei bonus through contemplation. And because Amalek is just an out and out chutzpahnik, and you'll see in a moment, and he infuses into the 70 nations more of this chutzpah, that their reason, their rationale, their justifications for their misdirected emotions should have an element of stubbornness. You have to kill Amalek. You have to wipe him off the face of the earth. And this is what he says in the next paragraph. V'hinei ha'tekef the klipas Amalek, the heart is the klip of Amalek. Mashu b'tekef ha'chutzpah shel Amail mitavadas. He has a hard disregard for decency and for respectability and for reason, which is beyond any reason. It's really below any reason, but it's without any reason. It says that it makes the 7 nations, and by extension the 70 nations, worse. They become more shameless. They become less in need of justifying their negative emotions, because they see Amalek's chutzpah, so it gives them a little bit more chutzpah. They never reach the status of Amalek that he doesn't care at all, and he's trying to fight with God knowing that he cannot win, but he's stubborn. But this explains that Amalek is not just before the other Goyim, and higher than the other Goyim, he's the beginning of all Goyim, because he adds to them in their chutzpah. Amalek is the first of all the Goyim. And for this reason, also it becomes so necessary to wipe Amalek off the face of the earth. Now, where do you see that Amalek's chutzpah affects the other nations should also have chutzpah? So the Rebbe gives you a raya from the famous Medrash. The proof that Amalek's chutzpah actually makes the other 7 and 70 nations worse is in the following. Because you know about Amalek, his whole idea is that he cools you down. He takes away your passion for Avodas Hashem. He cools you off. And of course, when it comes to Goyim, he cools off the respect that a Goy has for a Yid when he sees the nisim and the floys that the Eibush is doing for the Jewish people. Zachor it says in Medrash. It's an example from a boiling bath. The water is so hot that nobody can go into it. Along comes one bad person, and you know from Chazal that in Chumash B'liyal is used only in 2 cases. B'negei Avodah Zarah, b'negei Tzedakah. So this is only for Avodah Zarah. And he jumps into this boiling water, and he gets himself burnt. Wow. But he cools it off for the other people. Translates the Rebbe, what does that mean? V'hainu. Because Amalek is such a shameless chutzpahnik, all the other midas should be less respectful of the Jewish people, cools them off to the Jewish people, and gives them more of this chutzpah that Amalek is so famous for. The other nations also should have more of this chutzpah, not just the extent of chutzpah that they have, as they have by themselves, which is decorated by a midah of love or fear or beauty and so on. Amalek enhances their evil. And he brings a raya. There's a concept in Zachor called the mountains of darkness. Mountains grow out of the earth, they're above the earth, which represents a higher level, above the baseline. And they're often connected to emotions which are above reason. Emotions which are below reason are limited. Emotions which are above reason are much, much higher, and they're called mountains of darkness because the emotions are so strong that they're hidden. We can't fully experience them and reveal them. So there's a concept in Chassidus which says that the gam la'achrei shehem is badadim. When one takes control of mountains of darkness in holiness. In other words, but emotions that are above the mind. And one manages those emotions. Feelings that come from the nefesh are stronger than the brain. Even if they're good feelings, they're uncontrollable feelings. So the bever is to take these feelings which are above the brain and use the brain to direct them. They're stronger than the brain, but the brain is managing them to go in a constructive place. Even when the mind is being used to direct positive emotions, good emotions, alakus emotions, but are emotions that are above reason, in a good direction, the emotions are still stronger than the mind. The mind is simply trying to direct them. And that's in Ture, the Chashoicha, the Kedusha. And if you look in footnote 19, he brings one mocha from Alter Rebbe. I looked up that Alter Rebbe, I don't see it. I looked in the Teres Menachem Anocha, they bring two mochas, one from the Alter Rebbe and one from the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. My suspicion is this is a concept in Zohar, and it's not explained very well in Chassidus. The Rebbe makes mention of it here, but I don't know where this is discussed in Chassidus. I've never seen this before. But then the Rebbe says, Al derech zeh, and the same is also true, and Kolshkem v'Kavachayim, much more so, Beturech HaShechet de Klipa, the mountains of darkness in Klipa. When Klipa has emotions which are above reason, they're Klipa plus they're above reason, so the ability to manage them is far limited, far less, and even if you could manage them, they're still not completely contained by the mind, because they're stronger than the mind. Even emotions which are above the mind can correct them, not control them and limit them, but at least direct them in a good way. But then there is Goyim, then there's Amalaik, who doesn't allow any reason. He's not emotions which is above the brain, he's not even emotions, he's just Chutzpa. So now I take it to Kalipa, the negative emotions of the 7 and 70 nations are also made harder, al derech, to a lesser degree, but the same idea of chutzpah leitagash b'Amalek, chutzpah without a crown of Amalek himself, and therefore Amalek has to be killed. Amalek has to be killed because Amalek is irredeemable, and Amalek has to be killed because he's corrupting the nations that are redeemable. Because Amalek is the first and the beginning and the source of all klipa. It has to be a day over until he's completely destroyed. Raishis Goyim canal, since Amalek is the beginning of Goyim. The aboput has to be utterly destroyed. Because getting Amalek out of the way is not just removing an evil that has no redemption, that has no redeeming quality, but it allows us to redeem the 7 and 70 nations that without Amalek are more manageable. Now I want you to know that this is from 1973. In the later years, in the Mems, there's a Mamer, at least one that I remember. But the Rebbe gives a number of arguments where we see they were actually mevared Amalek itself. And one of them is Purim. Because of Amalek, there is Purim. The avoid of Adaliyah that brings out of us this very high level. And if not for Amalek, there wouldn't be a Purim. So because Amalek is responsible for Purim, so Amalek has an Aliyah because he creates Purim. And there's a number of different places where the Rebbe gives arguments in the Mamer and the Mems, which of course everything is very bekitzed, but there's Chedushim, Rabbim, Vatzumim, that there is some kind of a beater of Amalek, but not this Mamer. This Mamer has no mercy. This Mamer says Amalek has to be gotten rid of for his own sake and for the sake of the other nations as well. So now what's left to explain is how Amalek is destroyed. Now, physically Amalek is destroyed in war, but for this you have to have all the conditions. You have to have a tzibur, and you have to have a melech, and you have to have Havaye niach lemikol evei misaviv. But spiritually it's a constant mitzvah. And the first idea which allows the erasure of Amalek on the spiritual level is the idea of remembering. And the Rebbe is going to tell us something interesting. The Rebbe is going to connect Zechira, memory, to Atzmos HaNefesh, to above reason. Because in Chassidus, you have it in Samach Vov Ba'arichas, there's a huge discussion about the difference between remembering and not forgetting. The difference between remembering and not forgetting means something that you don't forget, you could forget. Some things you know, but it's possible that you should forget them. Remembering means it's impossible that it should ever be forgotten. And Chassidus explains that the level of memory, which is called Zikorin, is not just a better memory, I remember more. I remember in the kind of way that there's no possibility for forgetfulness. I heard a tape where the Rebbe was once speaking about the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe's father. In the course of the conversation, specifically what he was saying, I don't remember, but the Rebbe said these words. But the Rebbe Nishma Seidne Bechlal gewen sehr weit von Klolos in Yinashikha, which translates that Rebbe Rashab was altogether completely removed from the whole phenomena of forgetfulness. Not he didn't forget because he had a good memory. He had no connection to the concept of forgetfulness. And this can be explained very easily philosophically and even biologically, because the fact is that the human brain doesn't forget anything. Any memory, any experience is in the brain. It's never forgotten. What happens is we lose our ability to recall it. But nothing is lost to the brain. It's all there in the brain. You often have people who later in life will suddenly have memories that they'd forgotten for 50, 60, 70 or 80 years, and for whatever reasons they come back to them, because it's always there. So on the ideal level, on the optimum level, no one ever forgets anything. But the Eibishter built into the system, like Rashi says in Pashas Vayeshev, that there's a gzeira of shikha that we should forget, and somehow that's even advantageous, so we don't walk around with all of our pains, and so forth and so on. But the shikha is on the surface. In Amitas HaYonim, there's a place where nothing is forgotten. And there is a level in the neshama which is called Zachor. And Zachor doubles as to remember and to be masculine rather than to be feminine, to be a mashpia rather than a makabel. That's the idea, Zachor and Zachor. And the concept is, there's a level of the neshama where the way you know is not that you don't forget, is that it's impossible to forget. It's above the whole possibility of the inyan hashikha. And that is the meaning of Zachor as the shasach Amalaik. The place we have to have Amalaik is not in a place where we shouldn't forget him, but it's in a place where we cannot forget him, because the memory that recalls, that records, records the need to erase Amalaik is an idea which is by definition eternal. In order to affect the erasure of Amalek, you have to have a kedusha, an idea which is altogether beyond reason, and that is the meaning of the word Zachor. There's going to be several ideas. One of them is Zachor, Amalek. Another one is going to be Shem Avaya. Another one is going to be Mini Melech. He's going to show you several points that to fight Amalek you need to use a hardness and a toughness and a strength which is above reason, because Amalek is above reason. And the first is this idea of Zachor. The concept of memory is in the moichen of Chochma, and the moichen of Chochma means specifically Amail, above reason, above understanding. In other words, it's not just the intuitive mind rather than the analytical mind, the higher level of intellect versus the lower level of intellect. No, it's the absolute mind versus the variable mind, the place in the mind where things are just true versus the place in the mind where there's doing analysis, which is the difference between Chochma and Bina on a higher level. The whole process of analysis, of understanding and processing ideas and understanding them correctly. Mishtana b'shinaz, man, changes over time. As the pasuk says, the smarter we get, the more wisdom we have. But over here, wisdom means the kind of wisdom which is dynamic and changing. And even the lower levels of chokhmah change as time passes, because we grow intellectually. But then there's Zachor. Zachor is a madrega of chokhmah, which is an absolute dimension in chokhmah, and something which is recorded on that level you can never forget. The changes of time, even becoming more intelligent and becoming more healthy emotionally and spiritually and so forth, doesn't change it. Remember, without any changes, because it's a level that what's recorded there is absolute, and the meaning of absolute means it's super rational. It's not a memory which is based on a logic. It's a memory based, as they say in computer language, it's the hardware, it's not the software. Turn to page 54. The concept of memory, not that one remembers, but one remembers on a level which is called Zachor, is beyond reason and therefore beyond evolution and change and growth. That allows to erase Amail, because Amail is tough, and his toughness is irrational. You have to fight him with the toughness of Kedusha, which is also irrational. And the beginning of toughness is you'll never forget. The kind of, the way they say about the Holocaust, never forget. But it's not just never forget, it's remember. remember in a place that there'll never be a change in that recollection and in that memory. And therefore you'll never forget. There's a hardness to it. There's a permanence to it. And that's how you defeat Amalaik. You defeat the irrational with an irrationale of recollection, of never forgetting, of remembering. And of course this idea is always, it's not like the actual killing of Amalaik, which requires a community and a king and all kinds of other conditions. This is an absolute mitzvah. A Jew has to always know what Amalaik is on a level of Zachor, because that's a hardness and a toughness and a lack of flexibility, which is the only way Amalaik is defeated. And now comes the second example. The halacha is, practically speaking, Amalaik cannot be defeated until you appoint a king. This is a halacha, it's a law. And the practical law means exactly that. You need to have a king. But the philosophy behind that law is also constant. Because the inyan hamelech is bittul. The count of a king is complete submission to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the bittul of a king to the Eibishter is l'mayla mita'avadas, is above reason. Now let me first tell you what the Rebbe is going to say, and then we'll read it inside. A melech, a king, is called a merumim. He has a reimamas, which translates into English very uselessly as exalted, higher than the people. It's almost like a gaiva. A king has a feeling of being above the people that makes him responsible for the people, really. That hisraimim was that sense of upliftedness doesn't come from himself, it comes from the people. It's a midah shebenefesh. Every person has in his soul the possibility for reimamus, of being above others and therefore being responsible for them. But you can't bring it out yourself because it's called the helam she'einu b'mitzias. Only others can arouse it in you. That's why ein melech b'lei am. Can't have a king without the people, because the people reveal the midas hareimamus, they reveal the midas hamalchus in the king, and they make him into a melech. So a king is higher than everybody else. But Chassidus says a very interesting thing. The king being higher than everybody else means he feels higher. But that feeling of higher is actually a feeling of proximity to Hashem. What he's feeling is closer to the Eibishter, and his closeness to the Eibishter, he's above the people and responsible for the people. So there's a built-in duality to this experience of the exaltedness, of the feeling of upliftedness of a king. A, it makes it very powerful and very responsible and very resolute. B, he feels Hashem. In other words, his gaiva comes from Bittul, because he's so close to the Eibishter and he's so submissive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he is so above the people. So although on the outside a king is a person that needs to be above the people, needs to show strength, he's not allowed to ever show weakness. In fact, the halacha is melech shemochel al kvei ein kvei demachel. A king is not allowed to even forgo his honor if he wishes to. He has no right. He has to be a neikev and that he has to stand up for himself, a chuli. But where does that strength come from? From his humbleness in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is the philosophy that explains the contradictions by a king. On the one hand, the king is so much more powerful than anybody else, including the Sanhedrin and even the Navi and even the Kohen Gadol. And on the other hand, his whole life is a humility. That's why a king holds a Sefer Torah in his pocket to humble him. And many other things. Now let's read it. This also explains the relationship between the Minu Melech appointing a king, L'Mechias Amalek, and raising Amalek. Kigam Honyan the Melech, the concept of a king, which is on the one hand great gaiva, is Bittul Shalaman B'Tamadas, is rooted in Bittul to the Eibishter beyond reason. Okadis the Gemara says, Shahed Yet Kereh Barach V'Zekeh B'Sheba. A regular person bows only 4 times in Shemon Esrei, and not more. You're not supposed to bow more. Once in the beginning of the first bracha, which is called Aves, and of course you kneel when you say Baruch, you lower your head when you say Ata, and when you say Hashem, you actually raise your head. When you say Hashem's name, you raise your head. And the end of the first bracha, Baruch, you kneel, Ata, you bow, Hashem, Magen Avraham, you raise your head. And then of course, Moedim, which is the 18th bracha of Shemon Esrei, you bow, you say Moedim Anachnu Loch. And over here, you don't have a Baruch Ata, so you bow by Moedim until you say Moedim Anachnu Loch Sho Ata. Who? And when you say Hashem's name, you raise your head. And the end of the 18th bracha is Baruch Atah Hashem Hatev Shimcha L'cha No L'Heides. You bow again. So you kneel by Baruch, you bow by Atah, and you raise your head by Hashem. You're not allowed, and then of course by Eisa Shalom you bow again, which is another thing. You're not allowed to bow more than that, and you don't bow when you say Hashem's name. V'chein b'sharat tefillah, we say that brachas, the rest of davening, according to the sequence of brachas, the way people bow is all kinds of limitations. When it comes to a king, he kneels and bows. When he starts the first bracha and he keeps his head bent, he bows the whole Shemona Esrei. And a king godel is a middle ground in this halacha. But a king keeps his head bent the whole Shemona Esrei. Why? Because he needs to be humble. Now, even though you could argue that the reason the king needs to bow more than others is that mitzad hat kifus vayis nasas shabei. Since naturally he's so strong and so condescending over the community because he's their king, and therefore you have to worry about him becoming carried away with his gaiva, so he needs an extra humility. So in other words, you could argue that the humility is simply to protect him from going completely crazy. Says the Rebbe, that's the halacha. The opposite. The reason the king lowers it and keeps it lowered is because he's closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is more bottle. That's the idea of Bittul. In other words, not that the Bittul is to protect the gaiva, the Bittul is the source of the gaiva. Simen Beis. When he came back from the closer you are to the Eibishter, the humbler you are. A king specifically. Because he's closer to the Eibishter, has greater Bittul, and Kivin once he kneels and he bows, he doesn't raise his head anymore. Says the Rebbe, explains the connection between appointing a king and erasing Amalek. Appointing a king is bringing into a human being, not a gaiva, but a bittul a bittul beyond reason. And this bittul beyond reason is what you need to kill Amalek. So just like remembering Amalek, emphasis on Zachor in a way which is above forgetfulness, is a need of take of atmi. Appointing a king is having a person in your midst who has a take of atmi of bittul, and these two tools. And there's a third one, which is the Infashem Avaya, which he speaks about in the other Mamer, which are necessary to defeat Amalek. And he says like this: appointing a king is not only Malchus, because Malchus is feminine, Malchus is weak. Malchus is less than Megama Klum. Mינוי melech, appointing a king, is actually adding to Malchus from what is above Malchus. Masculine aspects. The feminine is considered weak and humble in its own way, in a different way. And the appointing a king means building up Malchus, and you're building up Malchus from Zohar and from Moichin, like it's explained in Kabbalah. Because Malchus by itself is less than Megama Klum, it's Nekuda Achas Tachas HaYesed, and the Zayin Tachtenis it gets from Zohar, and the Gimel Rishenis it gets from Moichin, a whole business. Binyan Malchus, in other words. Malchus is Bechinas Nukva. Malchus is feminine, which is weak. The word melech is masculine, which means he has a hardness and a strength. The concept of making a king is hamshachas b'malchus nukva bechinas zachor. You bring into the feminine, which is by itself weak and humble, the power of the masculine. And if you wanted to explain it in other words, the weakness of the feminine is the bittul. The strengthening from the masculine is the hardness. But this hardness and this bittul are inseparable. The humility, which is associated with Malchus by itself, is the basis for the hardness and the gaiva to what's added to Malchus. So therefore a king, his nature is bittul in his gaiva, or his gaiva is rooted in humility. And in general, so Malchus is seviv mamale, and mינוי melech is hamshachas bechinas seviv, and even higher than seviv, the shachas is nasas atzmi, which is the Malchus mishash bechinas nasas atzmi. So Malchus, appointing a king, is not just Malchus. Appointing a king is bringing the Malchus koiches, which are much higher than Malchus, till atmas amuhus. And therefore, and of course you see that I just rushed through that. And now bringing the masculine aspect into the humble, feminine aspect of Malchus, from Zohar, from Seviv Kalam, and from Atzmos. This affects that there shouldn't just be a bittul, because of a weakness, which is Lamata Mitam Badas, which is from Nukva by itself. But a bittul which is higher than reason, says the Rebbe, Pelim Bittul Klipas Amalek. This is the basis to the defeating of Amalek. So the word Zachor is a strength which is Atzmiistic, which helps defeat Amalek. And mינוי melech is a koyach, which is a koyach Atzmi, and a take of Atzmi, which helps defeat Amalek. As we said earlier, And the Zachor, Lashon Zachor of the word Zachor is very similar to the idea that meaning Melech is bringing Zachor into the Keva. When you make tzitzis, and you look at the tzitzis, and you remember all the mitzvahs, that the meaning was Chatem is to remember on a level which you can't forget. Zachor, Lashon Zachor, Amshach, Zachor, Batlas, Klippus, Amalek. And this I think you have even in the Samach Vav, where he talks in the Mamer of Shlach. This idea of Zachor, which is not just you don't forget. You can't forget because you know in a way that's atzmiistic, and that toikev allows you to defeat Amalek. And like I told you before, in the second Maimon he's going to bring a third aspect, that Melchamas Havaya ba'Amalek, that fighting Amalek goes from Shem Havaya, and specifically Havaya Deliela, that L'chayda normally is above Klipa, when it comes to Amalek, Atzmos and Muz, to fight with Amalek, Havaya Yechetu Medivov. And those are the three tools that the Maimorim are bringing here, how you fight with Amalek. Since Amalek is so irrational, you fight with him with a strength of irrationale, which is the idea of memory, and the idea of appointing a king, and the idea of Shem Havai. And the Rabbi finishes with Zachor, you have to remember always about Amalek. But then the pasuk says, when you have certain conditions, you have a king, and you have peace, then you can physically erase Amalek, because there's two in Yonim. Is remembering Amalek spiritually, and remembering with a hardness which comes from Chochmah, which is able to defeat the Chutzpa of Amalek. This is the Chutzpa of Kedusha. Hamshach as bechinas the Chura Kanal, bringing down a masculine aspect with a hardness of the masculinity, which is the same idea of Mini Melech. That's always Beruchnias. But in the Mini Melech, when you have an actual physical king, then you have peace from the nations of the world, and then you can be Amalek bepashtas. So there is the Ruchnis Dik of Amalek, which is always, and there's the actuality of Amalek, and that Ruchnis Dik idea also has a connection to the Ruchnis Dik idea of Mini Melech. And then you have the actual erasing of Amalek, which requires the actual Mini Melech, as we discussed before. By also appointing a king in Ruchnis, which is Bittul, by being close to Hashem, and erasing Amalek, defeating the Chutzpa through our Chutzpa of Kedusha. We do it spiritually as individual people. We're able to put up our own personal Beis HaMikdash, which is also spiritual. This is personal by us. But ultimately this ends in the Gimel in Yonim Elu Gam B'Nei Kal Yisrael. How this happens on a cosmic level, and therefore it happens on an actual level. First of all, Yaakov Melech, we base David Mini Melech, a king comes, David HaMelech, that's the Mini Melech. And then Yom Chol Mechamas Adeshavin Atzech, he fights all of the Eibishter's wars, which includes also Shabbat Nechel Gam B'Chiyas Amalek, the war with Amalek. And finally, Yivne Beis HaMikdash B'Mkayim, he builds the Beis HaMikdash. So the beginning of it is an Inyan Pnimi, which every Jew can and must do always, no matter where he or she lives. And then this brings about the collective inyan of Mינוי Melech and Binyan and Mechias Amalek and all the other nations that are saying Yisrael and building the Beis HaMikdash. We do our personal Geulas, and this Yom Shech B'Korev Mamash brings about very quickly. And of course, in the later years, the Rebbe changes B'Korev Mamash into take of a Mayad Mamish, Gama Klula calls the general Gula, Uba in the kind of way with Simchas El Mareshiv, that our head is a joy which is eternal. And as I told you earlier, on Purim, the Rebbe said the same Maimon again. But the Purim Maimon I'm going to teach in two classes. The middle 4.5 pages, which is a little longer than this, is going to begin Raishis Goyim Amalek. It's not going to begin Zachor, although it's going to have Zachor in it, which is basically a repeat of this Maimon with a little bit more hesbed. That'll be one class. And the second class is going to be the union of Tefillah. Ishihudi Ha'ibishun Abida, that the Koyach, the Tefillah Amalek, happens only when we daven first. Ukafishi is by Lakaman Amir Hashem. Afreilich Noder.